Good morning, everyone. It's good to see all of you here today. What a blessed day we have. Oh, nice and cool and beautiful sun shining. What we're going to talk about today is in the Impossible Evolution is the age of Earth. As you know, we have talked about, 2 weeks ago, we talked about, is there really a God? Last week, we talked about overpopulation. And this week we're talking about the age of the Earth. And the reason why I put this under the category of impossible evolution is because they use evolution as their base. And we're going to show this as we look through this, and we're going to see how that thinking is so flawed. Now, I want you to open your minds up to this, and this is not going to be easy because we have been conditioned by what we are constantly bombarded with. We've been conditioned in school, we've been conditioned by movies, we've been conditioned by songs, we've been conditioned in many ways by commercials. And you know, commercials are probably the most important part of the show because they're the most interesting. And you remember what was it, the Geico commercial where it's so easy, even a caveman could do it? We've been conditioned to think that evolution is right when it is so blatantly, obviously impossible that anyone who listens to that and considers that ought to laugh outright in the face of it. Okay, let's take a look now at what we're talking about here on the age of the Earth. And I find it fascinating that when you look at man has recorded about it and written about it and said about it, the world says things, but they have absolutely no record of it. And meaning they have no one who was there to tell them what really happened. All they have is they're saying, there it is, and yet there's nothing there. Now, let me give you an example. You have to have a calibration. Let's say we look out here on the street and we see a car, and a car goes by, and we say, well, there goes a car. Okay, I see the car, and it's going 60 miles an hour. That's true. We can see it's going 60 miles an hour. What can you not know about it? You can't know how long it's been going unless you have a calibration. If you said, okay, it started here, it's going 60 miles an hour, now you can use that calibration to be able to say, oh, it's been on the road now for an hour or for 10 minutes or wherever it is. We don't have that calibration. There's no record of the beginning that the world has. And so what they do is they look at all kinds of things and try to determine that when they can't determine it from the things. To be like me, staring at that car and saying, well, I see some dust on that car. Obviously, that car went through some dust. Let's go find some dust back there somewhere, and we'll know how long they've been on the road. Now, that's what they're doing. So let's take a look at what they say. They say that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Interesting. It's really old, give or take 50 million years. I mean, when you're talking about billions, what's 50 million? It's just nothing. You know, that's what we talk about trillions today in our budget, and what's a million to a trillion? What's a billion to a trillion? I mean, it's nothing. Once we get into these big numbers like that, the million becomes a very small number. I can't think that high, but I'm just telling you that's what they do. And so they're saying the universe began and it has created the Earth. It was a spin-off of it, if you will, and created the sun and the Earth and all that sort of stuff. And they figure it's about 4.5 billion years old. Now, they've got to do this. I remember when I was a kid and we went to school, and it was something like 4 to 6 million years old. And probably the most popular one at that time was 4.5 million. Million, not billion. And so they've had to increase it. And they've had to increase it because they have trouble trying to figure it out. The problem is not the Earth. The problem is they can't get the process and can't understand how it's supposed to go. So they have to keep adding and adding and adding years. Let me show you what I'm talking about. The concept is that there was first primordial soup. And from the primordial soup came an amoeba and so on and so forth. And out of this soup came man. However, they have no source of life. At some point, somebody said, there was lightning, and the lightning produced life. But they have no source of this energy that would produce life. You remember years ago watching the old Frankenstein movies, and he had the Frankenstein on the table, and he had him hooked up to all kinds of wires and everything. He had a big antenna up there, and he was waiting for a lightning storm, and the lightning hit it, and he had some kind of capacitors that increased the energy, and it produced Frankenstein, who was alive. He's alive! And then he was able to terrorize people and kill them because of this life that he had. However, they have no source of life in evolution. Something doesn't come from nothing. Something has to have a source. They don't have that. So now what happens is they're looking at this primordial soup, and the primordial soup theory states that the beginning Earth had no oxygen, but methane, hydrogen, water vapor, and ammonia. When these chemicals are mixed, they contain elements, carbon and nitrogen, which can make amino acids if they're arranged right. That's true. However, the odds are far against them being arranged properly. And so what they do is they say, well, from this soup came this amoeba, came this fish, and then the fish started walking on land, and we got animals, we got monkeys, we got man, and man's turned into what he is today. Well, here's where they're having problems. Here's why they have to keep changing the age of the Earth. Because how do we get you from going from an amoeba or a fish and a reptile, which are all cold-blooded, to a warm-blooded creature like a bird or a human or an animal? The amount of changes that would have to happen for that to be possible are astronomical. And so when they look at it and they think of how the transition would have to be done, then they would say, well, we've got to add more years. And the 4.5 million years has now become 4.5 billion years because they know it is impossible. It's impossible. So then they said that what we can see, though, is that the age of human existence came about from Africa, and we've been here millions of years, and man has come from there, which is interesting because their theory of overpopulation actually disturbs the theory that man's evolved, because if man had evolved for millions of years, we'd have a lot more people. And we can see now exactly what we talked about last week. Well, what does God record? Interesting that God uses the words in Genesis 1 when he talks about all of these, where he talks about how he has created the earth on each day, and each day it says, and God said. Look in chapter 1, verse 3. And God said, let there be light. Now, when God spoke, the universe existed. So all of a sudden we have what is. It's interesting too when you look at the this verse, chapter chapter 1, verse 2, it says the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the earth, and the Spirit of God was hovering above the waters. Okay, we got the primordial soup right there. God saying, I started with this, and here's what I did, and he created the universe. Now, he not only created earth, but he created all the things that support Earth. You have the sun and the moon and all the things moving in their beautiful procession that's going on, this dance of the planets. And not only here, but even beyond it, and to whatever it is we can find. If we go out there and we find this black hole, and we go through the black hole, and we look and see what's out there, whatever is there, God spoke into existence when he spoke the earth into existence. It's all there. It's not starting and then coming. And we've got evidence for that. And notice that when they try to date things, you've got a problem with the global flood. Genesis 6 through 7 talks about the global flood and how that the earth even changed. The earth was broken open and the water came out. Did you know that the earth is the only planet that has platonic movement, has the movement of the continents and all this sort of stuff? The only one. All the others have a hard surface, and they're all cold. The earth was under a firmament, and because of that, it was warm and perfect like a terrarium. And firmament and terrarium, both hard words to say. But when the earth was flooded, things changed, and God uses the certain movements of the earth to warm the earth, volcanoes and so on and so forth. And we're open to more elements. And the global flood, which they choose to reject, by the way. In fact, there was a guy over in France who was supposedly a very intelligent man back in right after the, I think it was around the 1500s. I'm sorry. And he was saying that as he looked at excavation of Paris, he counted 24 different layers. And he said, obviously, there were 24 local floods. Instead of saying there was one global flood, as the Bible says, they constantly try their best to look and see that there is no God and it has to be from man. So even looking at the human existence, they know good and well it came from Mount Ararat, which is where Noah landed and branched out, Genesis 9 through 11, but they reject that even though the evidence shows it. They reject God. Some of the objective evidence. Now, objective means we look at the object and it tells us what's going on. We don't bring a bias to it. We let the object tell us. And if the object tells us something, we can observe it. We can write down what it says. We can even test it. But if the object tells us something, and it tells us it began at a certain time or it was created instantly, we have to allow it to say. We have to allow it to prove whether God is right or man is right. So the first part we'll look at was the lunar module. I just love this. When we start studying this stuff, it's just fascinating to me how anybody can hold any credibility at all in evolution. The lunar module going to the moon. Now, here's what's going on. NASA had never been out in space before. John F. Kennedy said, we're going to go to the moon. And so within just a few months, that's what we did. And they actually landed on the moon soon thereafter. So the first lunar module, what they were concerned about was dust. They were really concerned that dust was going to overcome the module and make it where they couldn't take off again. And so NASA, doing all their study without considering God, and let me tell you something, they're still doing that today. If you want to watch Discovery Channel or History Channel, do so, but do it with knowing that when they give you facts about evolution, it's a lie. When they tell you billions of years, you know better. And NASA still is figuring things when they show you Mars. They're looking for life. They're looking for water. They're looking for an Earth-like atmosphere. They're wanting something to be there to prove God wrong. So when they made the module, what they did was they figured, we have measured dust coming in from outer space here to the Earth, and so they figured there was going to be 57 inches of dust, 54 inches of dust. Now, 54 is about the height of your light switches. It's about comfortable for a man to turn on a light and turn it off. That's 54 inches. It is in Texas. I don't know about here. I'm sure the electrical laws are pretty similar all over the world. All over America. Not all over the world, but you see some pretty strange things in other parts of the world. But in this case, let's use the example of 54 inches of a light switch. So they figured there's going to be that much dust, and they wanted to make sure that they would not get the dust in the module motor so they could take off again. They're very concerned about this. So they made big snowshoe type feet. You see them there? And they made long legs. You see, even the ladder doesn't go all the way down because they really expected to be deep in this dust. What actually happened when they got there was they landed with the snowshoe feet and everything, but there was only about an inch to an inch and a half of dust, which is consistent with a less than 7,000-year-old moon and Earth. And remember, they had to be created at the same time because God said that in his days when he created the moon and so on, just a couple of days apart. So we've got this proof that NASA's wrong and always has been wrong about evolution and measuring things by evolution. And then we turn and look at the age of the rocks. Now, this is very interesting. The age of the rocks show, according to scientists, the age in which those particular rocks were put, those particular layers were put down. And they look down here at the bottom, you see that little trilobite right there. That trilobite, they figure, is 4 million years old. And they say, well, look, those rocks are 4 million years old. How do you know that? Well, a trilobite has to be the first because it's at the bottom. Obviously, the trilobite was collected first in the fossils, and the first layer of sediment put down was that, and that was 4 million years ago. The trilobite's 4 million years old, and it's in those rocks. So those rocks must be 4 million years old. It's cyclical in understanding, and yet what we do find, and I'll show you a picture a little bit later, is a strata everywhere. And we even find that when we've looked through it and dug through it, that there are trees growing through the different strata, and which negates this model, and yet they continue to teach it today. And if things go between the strata, then you know good and well it's false. Let's turn to something simple called the granite. Granite had to be instantaneous. Anybody knows if they have granite countertops, which are just gorgeous, they are porous. And they have to be sealed. You have to seal them, otherwise they'll be stained. Anybody in here agree? Okay, right. You know about these granite countertops and how they have to be sealed. And the reason why they are porous like this is they were like a Alka-Seltzer being thrown in water, and when the fizz happens, God instantly stopped it, and immediately you have granite. If the fizz in Alka-Seltzer had been allowed to continue, at some point the fizz would be gone. So we know it didn't happen over time. We know it happened instantly. God spoke, and instantly it became, and it was what it was. We know that. We know the age of the rocks. They were created the day that God said when he formed the earth. And we know that they were created by God for man, purposefully. Now, what about the fossils? Fossils, they're in rocks. In fact, I knew a guy one time who was studying about trilobites. Boy, he just loved trilobites. He'd go out every weekend and he would be looking for trilobites. Trilobite was the little creepy looking bug. And he enjoyed it because he knew the rocks were so old. Climbs up on these mountains. He has his little pickaxe and little pick, and he's cracking the rocks open, and there's a trilobite. And he just loved this because it just kept proving that God was wrong, man's right, there is evolution. And one day he cracks one of them open, and it popped open. Sure enough, there was a trilobite. However, it was in the footprint of a sandal. Now, these fossils were made when sediment or strata was put down. Everybody knows that if you go, well, you know about snorkeling and going into the water and everything, you don't see dead fish as a general rule laying on the bottom of the ocean. And the reason is because God has designed it where there are creatures to take care of that. You know, just like in the wild here. If you go out here and you kill an animal or you see an animal's been killed, it doesn't just sit there. There are things that break it down, eat it. There are wolves or bugs or whatever that's going to take care of it. The same as with in the water. So how would you find an entire fish encrusted as a fossil? Because something catastrophic happened. The fish was trapped in the sediment, and the sediment became rock. It was trapped during the global flood. It shows the evidence of God was correct. It shows that when he says there was a flood and it covered the earth and there was nothing left, we know this. We know there wasn't. And so when we look at that, we see these strata everywhere. You can go down Columbia River, look across there, see all the strata. You know it was laid down. You can see how it was laid down in waves even. It's just fascinating. Nothing out there disproves God and what he said. In fact, if you want to, you can go down to the beach over in over to the west, and you can see huge rocks that were pushed out there from the river. And it wasn't that long ago, or they wouldn't be huge; they would have already disappeared. And human existence came from Africa. Well, no surprise. Human existence came because of the fact that man came down and from the ark and started his life. 8 people. Can you imagine what that was like? Millions of people before. Now only 8 left on the entire earth. You saw the flood. You stayed on it for over a year. Come down off the water, nothing's there, and you start looking, and your creatures you brought onto the ark because God told you to are going to go out and reproduce, and horses are going to produce horses, and eagles are going to produce eagles, and fish are going to produce fish, and people are going to produce people, because the set law is kind after kind. And don't you know that if it wasn't so, you'd be afraid to have children? And yet we have mutants showing up on TV, can do all kinds of stupid stuff. And we long for that because we want to think evolution is true, and we want to be able to think that there is something beyond and greater than us. And there is. There's God. Now let's turn to our scripture over in Ephesians. Listen to what he says about that. Ephesians 6, y'all turn to it. I want to tell you a little bit about this book I saw the other day. This book is called The Plot to Change America. Now, this is fascinating because back in 1952, the communists decided they wanted to change America. And they wanted to do so because America needed to change very, very much. And what they said was that the way in which the worker thinks has been indoctrinated into him, and he won't accept communism, and he won't accept being ruled, but it's the best thing in his interest. And so in order for us to accomplish that, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to teach it to children and wait years, and then teach it to their children and wait years, and then teach it to their children, and so on. And that's exactly what they have done. And here's what they said, that the worker who went out there and thought he was living for himself and could do whatever he wanted to do for himself and not for the collective good, had a false consciousness. And what he needed was to raise his consciousness to the point of being greater. And here's what he says in Ephesians 6. Listen to this. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in heavy realms. Therefore, put on the armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. Let me tell you something. We're at war, and we're at war against the world. Stand strong for God. Don't stand for the world. Don't forget. Stand for God and be his person. He tells the truth. He alone knew what happened, not man. Earth is only about a little less than 7,000 years old. Don't believe anybody else. Thank you.